My name is Emily Thompson, and I was 32 years old when my marriage quietly began to end, even though I didn't recognize it at the time. Back then, I believed stability was the same thing as safety. My husband and I lived a life that looked settled from the outside. Bills were paid, schedules were predictable, no one raised their voice. I mistook the absence of conflict for proof that everything was intact. Our marriage wasn't warm, but it wasn't cruel either. It moved on routine, not affection. We spoke more about logistics than feelings, and I told myself that was what adulthood looked like. Love, I assumed, matured into something quieter, something less demanding. I didn't ask for more because nothing was technically wrong. I had stepped back from my career after we married, not because he demanded it, but because it seemed practical. He earned more, I supported. It felt like a partnership built on reason. I trusted that what we shared was mutual, even if it wasn't spoken. There were moments, small and easy to dismiss, when I felt strangely absent from my own life. Decisions were made before I knew they were being discussed. Accounts were handled. Conversations ended before I reached the part where my opinion mattered. I noticed, but I minimized it. At 32, I thought security was something you earned by being agreeable, patient, and low maintenance. I didn't realize how much of my footing depended on beliefs I had never tested, or how quietly a foundation can weaken long before it collapses. I was certain that loyalty guaranteed permanence, and that as long as I stayed reasonable, nothing essential in my life could truly be taken away from me without warning. The changes didn't arrive as arguments or ultimatums. They came folded into ordinary days, disguised as efficiency and care. My husband stopped asking questions he used to pretend mattered. He listened, but his attention drifted, like my words were background noise he no longer needed to process. I noticed the pauses where responses used to be, the way silence replaced curiosity. Money became the language he spoke most fluently. He began handling things so I wouldn't have to worry. Accounts shifted, passwords changed. It was presented as relief, as protection. I told myself it was reasonable. After all, he was better with numbers. I had stepped back from work. It made sense, didn't it? Decisions started happening without me. A change in insurance, a new savings plan, small investments. He informed me after the fact, casually, as if my role was to acknowledge rather than participate. When I hesitated, he framed it as concern. Why stress over things he already took care of? I felt myself shrinking, but there was no clear moment to point to, no single offense, just an accumulation of quiet exclusions. I adapted without realizing I was doing it. I learned which questions slowed things down. I learned which opinions were inconvenient. I learned how to nod and move on. When discomfort surfaced, I smothered it with logic. He wasn't unkind, he wasn't loud, he wasn't irresponsible. Everything still functioned. The house ran, the bills cleared, life looked intact. That made doubt feel irrational. Any resistance I felt seemed dramatic, even ungrateful. I worried that speaking up would make me appear difficult, or worse, incapable. So I adjusted my expectations instead. I told myself this was just how marriages settled into adulthood. But beneath the routines, something essential was being removed piece by piece. I couldn't name it yet. I only knew that my presence was becoming optional in my own life, and that each time I accepted less involvement, it became harder to imagine asking for more again. The erosion was quiet enough that I blamed myself for noticing, then questioning why it was happening. He didn't leave in the way people expect departures to happen. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic confession. He left with the same calm he used for everything else, as if this were simply another decision he had already finalized. I came home to a quiet house and a note that explained nothing, only that he needed space and had already arranged the practical details. It took hours before I understood what that meant. My card declined at the grocery store, then again at the pharmacy. I assumed it was a system error, something temporary. When I checked our accounts, the screens loaded slowly,
almost politely, before showing nothing I recognized as accessible. Savings moved, joint accounts emptied. My name was still there, technically, but functionally irrelevant. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited for panic to arrive. It didn't. What came instead was a numb disbelief, like watching a familiar room being dismantled piece by piece. I called him once. It went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound like pleading.
By the next day, I learned how thorough he had been. Subscriptions canceled, insurance changed, even the phone plan was no longer in my name. Each discovery felt smaller than the last, not because it hurt less, but because there was less of me left to react. He hadn't taken objects, he had removed access. The house was unbearably quiet after that. No movement, no explanation, just the steady awareness that something irreversible had already happened while I was still assuming good faith. I replayed conversations, searching for warnings I might have missed, signs that could have justified this outcome. None of them led anywhere useful. I wasn't angry yet. Anger requires a sense of standing. What I felt was collapse, slow and inward. The question wasn't how to confront him or undo what he'd done, it was how to exist inside a life that had been hollowed out so cleanly I wasn't sure where to begin filling it again, or whether I was even allowed to try without permission anymore. That uncertainty pressed heavier than fear, settling into me as something I would have to learn how to carry. Survival stopped feeling automatic and began feeling conditional, uncertain, and frighteningly dependent on choices I had never imagined needing to make alone. I didn't tell anyone at first, not because there was no one to call, but because speaking it out loud would make it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. Alone, I could still pretend this was temporary, a misunderstanding that would resolve itself if I've stayed quiet long enough. I replayed everything I had done in the marriage, looking for the mistake that explained the ending. I questioned my judgment, my intelligence, my value. I wondered how I could have missed something so complete while believing I was being careful. Every memory became evidence against me. If I had been smarter, more attentive, less accommodating, maybe this wouldn't have happened. That logic settled easily because blame felt more familiar than uncertainty. Shame kept me still. I imagined the conversations before they happened, the careful pauses, the looks of sympathy that would confirm what I feared most. I wasn't unlucky. I wasn't betrayed. I was foolish. Asking for help felt like announcing that I had mismanaged my own life. I told myself I should fix it quietly, without witnesses. Friends crossed my mind, then drifted away. I had been distant for years, absorbed in a marriage that required my attention but returned little. Reaching out now felt transactional, like asking for emotional credit I hadn't earned. I convinced myself it was kinder to stay silent than to reappear only when I needed something. Family felt closer but heavier. My father, especially. He had always been present without being intrusive, supportive without conditions. That made him harder to face. Accepting his help would mean admitting that I had built my independence on assumptions that didn't hold. It would mean revisiting old promises I'd made about standing on my own. I delayed that reckoning by focusing on small tasks. I counted cash. I rationed groceries. I planned days around avoiding decisions I couldn't afford to make yet. Each hour alone made the next one easier to endure, but harder to escape. Isolation became a system, one I maintained with discipline and exhaustion. Some nights I sat in the quiet and imagined telling my father everything, not the details, just the outcome. I felt the weight of his concern before it existed, and it pressed against my chest until I couldn't breathe properly. I wasn't ready for his questions or my answers, so I stayed silent longer than I should have, mistaking endurance for strength and believing that as long as I didn't ask for help, I could still pretend I hadn't failed completely. That silence wasn't peaceful. It was rigid, deliberate, and exhausting. I mistook restraint for control and isolation for dignity.
Each day I avoided reaching out, the story hardened inside me, becoming something I would eventually have to break. I didn't yet know how, only that avoiding help was costing me more than asking ever could. It was a quiet countdown, though I didn't recognize it yet, just the pressure building toward a moment I couldn't postpone any longer. The card had been in my wallet for years, untouched, its edges worn only by time. My father had given it to me long before I married, back when independence was something he encouraged but never demanded. He told me to keep it for emergencies, not for convenience, not for comfort, for the kind of moment when pride becomes a liability. I never intended to use it. Carrying it felt symbolic, like a quiet reassurance that didn't need to be activated to be real. As long as it stayed unused, I could believe I was fully self-sufficient, that my life was supported by my own choices rather than a safety net I pretended not to need. Using it felt like crossing back into a version of myself I thought I had outgrown. After my husband left, I noticed the card more often, not because I wanted to reach for it, but because avoiding it required effort. Each time my own resources came up short, my hand would pause over my wallet before pulling away. I told myself it wasn't necessary yet, that there were still ways to manage without it.
The hesitation wasn't about money, it was about identity. I had built my adulthood around the idea that I could stand on my own, even if that meant standing quietly. Using my father's card felt like undoing years of restraint, like admitting that the structure I trusted had never truly been mine. I worried about what it would confirm, not to him, but to myself. I rehearsed explanations I didn't want to give. I imagined his reaction, not disappointment, but concern, which somehow felt worse. He wouldn't question my decision, he would simply understand, and that understanding carried a weight I wasn't ready to hold yet. I didn't want to be seen as someone who needed rescuing. But survival has a way of simplifying choices. There came a morning when my calculations stopped working, when the numbers no longer bent enough to cover what was necessary: food, transportation, the basic logistics of continuing to exist without borrowing from strangers or apologizing to people I had already distanced myself from. I sat at the table and laid everything out in front of me, not dramatically, methodically. I listed what I had left, what was coming in, and what wasn't. The conclusion arrived quietly. This wasn't about dignity anymore, it was about continuity. When I finally picked up the card, there was no surge of emotion, no rush, just a steady recognition that this was the most rational option available. I wasn't defying anything. I wasn't reclaiming power. I was choosing to remain functional. At the store, I waited for hesitation to return. It didn't. The card went through without issue. No alarms, no questions, just a receipt printed and slid across the counter, as ordinary as any other transaction. Walking back to my car, I understood that something irreversible had shifted, not because I used the card, but because I allowed myself to prioritize survival over the image I had been protecting. I didn't feel relief, I felt clarity. I didn't know then what using it would set in motion. I only knew that I had crossed a line I once believed defined me, and that on the other side of it, I was still standing. That was enough to keep going, even if the consequences hadn't arrived yet. After that purchase, I tried to put the card back into the category it belonged in: used, acknowledged, and set aside. I didn't call my father. I didn't explain. I assumed silence would keep the moment contained, that one transaction could exist without consequence if I treated it that way. I underestimated how closely he paid attention. He noticed the charge the same day, not because it was large, but because it was out of pattern. My father has always read numbers the way other people read tone. He didn't react, he observed. I learned later that he didn't call immediately or jump to conclusions. He waited, letting information accumulate before touching it. Within days, he understood more than I had said. He saw the emptied accounts attached to my name,
the abrupt shifts, the legal rearrangements that don't happen unless someone plans to leave without resistance. He didn't need my version yet. The structure told its own story. I remained unaware while he moved quietly. He contacted a lawyer he trusted, not to escalate, but to understand boundaries. He requested statements, he traced timelines, he asked neutral questions that didn't signal alarm. There was no confrontation, no emotional appeal, just verification. I felt the change before I understood it. Subtle things loosened, holds disappeared, a bill processed that I had assumed would bounce. A small deposit appeared without explanation. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make the air feel different. I knew something was happening, but I didn't know where it would land. When my father finally called, his voice was steady. He didn't ask why I used the card. He asked if I was safe. The question caught me off guard because it wasn't about money at all. I answered honestly. That seemed to be enough for him to continue. He told me only what I needed to know, that he was handling some things, that I didn't need to fix anything right now, that this wasn't about proving anyone wrong. His restraint unsettled me more than anger would have. It suggested scale, patience, and experience. I stayed out of the way. That wasn't avoidance, it was instinct. I had spent years managing emotional labor, smoothing edges, anticipating reactions. This was different. I didn't need to explain or justify. My role was to observe and remain steady. The waiting became its own pressure. I imagined my husband moving forward confidently, believing the story ended cleanly. He had planned for my silence. He had calculated my isolation. What he hadn't accounted for was how little noise real leverage makes when it's applied correctly. I sensed the imbalance before it became visible. The ground didn't shake, it shifted. Something that had felt sealed was now permeable. I didn't feel victorious or afraid. I felt alert. I understood then that my husband had mistaken my quiet for absence and my father's distance for disinterest. He had built his exit on assumptions that no one would look too closely once I disappeared from the picture. He was wrong. I didn't know what would surface or when. I only knew that the story was no longer moving in a straight line, and that forces I hadn't invited were now present, precise, and paying attention. That awareness changed how I breathed, how I waited. I stopped rehearsing explanations and started conserving energy. Whatever came next wouldn't require my performance. It would unfold on its own timeline, indifferent to my readiness. All I had to do was remain still enough to see it clearly, without interfering, without trying to control outcomes that were aligning beyond me. I didn't hear about the consequences from him. They arrived indirectly, filtered through pauses in conversations, through information offered carefully, as if to avoid waking something volatile. My father shared fragments, and even those were stripped of commentary. There were inquiries, requests, attention that couldn't be brushed aside.
My husband's confidence began to fray at the edges before it broke. I noticed it in the tone of an email forwarded to me without context, his language suddenly formal, defensive. There were delays where certainty used to be, extensions requested, explanations drafted too carefully to feel natural. He was being watched now, and he knew it. Nothing collapsed publicly. There were no headlines or dramatic reckonings. Instead, pressure appeared where he hadn't planned for it. Accounts flagged, agreements revisited. Choices he'd made quietly were now being reviewed under light he hadn't expected. The system he trusted to protect him had turned procedural, indifferent to intention. I stayed silent. That part mattered. I didn't ask questions or request updates. When information reached me, I absorbed it without reaction. There was no satisfaction in it, only a steady recognition of cause and effect. Watching consequences unfold is different when you're not the one delivering them. He tried to reassert control in small ways, an unnecessary message, a suggestion framed as concern. Each attempt felt delayed, like a reflex firing after the moment had passed. I didn't respond.
Silence wasn't strategy anymore, it was alignment. I no longer needed to participate to be positioned correctly. What surprised me most was how ordinary it felt. I had imagined reversal would be loud, validating, unmistakable. Instead, it was administrative. Phone calls returned, doors half opened. His world narrowed incrementally, not as punishment, but as outcome. There was no urge to confront him or demand acknowledgement. I didn't need him to understand what was happening. Understanding wasn't required for the shift to complete itself. The balance was already changing, and it didn't need my voice to continue. As the distance grew, I felt lighter, not triumphant. Power, I learned, doesn't announce itself when it arrives late. It settles quietly, replacing chaos with neutrality. The moment I realized I no longer felt compelled to explain my silence, I understood that whatever leverage he once believed he held had already expired. It didn't feel like justice, and it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like gravity returning to a room that had been tilted too long. I kept my distance and let the process remain impersonal. That restraint protected me more than confrontation ever could, and it confirmed that silence, when chosen, can outlast any argument without demanding validation or closure. He reached out the way people do when they want to test whether a door is still unlocked, casually at first. A short message asking how I was doing, as if nothing significant had occurred between us. The tone was neutral, almost polite, and carefully incomplete. I didn't reply. A few days later, another message arrived, this one longer, framed as concern. He mentioned loose ends, unresolved details, things we should talk through. It read like an invitation, but it carried an expectation underneath it, that I would resume my role as the reasonable one, the one who explains herself. I noticed how little it stirred in me. There was no spike of anxiety, no urge to defend or clarify. The distance I felt wasn't deliberate, it had settled naturally, built from weeks of observing rather than reacting. I could see his uncertainty now, the way his language circled instead of landing. When the messages became more direct, I understood what he wanted. Not reconciliation, not understanding, control of the narrative. He needed confirmation that he still existed in my decisions, that my silence meant confusion, not choice. I didn't give him that. I wasn't withholding anything. I simply no longer had the impulse to participate. The clarity surprised me. I didn't need him to recognize what he had done or to agree with my version of events. I didn't need to be heard to know I was finished speaking. There was a time when I would have drafted careful responses, softened my words, anticipated his reactions. Now, even imagining that felt unnecessary. Explanation requires shared ground. We no longer had any. His attempts tapered off, each one slightly less confident than the last. I watched them pass without urgency. Silence had stopped being a reaction and become a boundary I didn't have to announce. The power shift wasn't something I declared or even acknowledged out loud. It existed in what I no longer reached for. I didn't need closure from him. I didn't need permission to move forward. The story he believed he could re-enter had already continued without him, and I wasn't responsible for updating him on where it was going next. Letting him fade from the center of my attention felt less like loss and more like alignment. I wasn't cutting him out. I was simply no longer organizing my life around his awareness of it. That realization settled quietly, preparing me for a calm I hadn't yet fully experienced, but could finally imagine holding. The calm didn't arrive all at once. It settled gradually in the spaces where urgency used to live. Mornings became quieter, not because there was nothing to manage, but because nothing felt immediately threatened. I handled my finances carefully, deliberately, learning what it meant to support myself without secrecy or dependence. Each bill paid felt less like survival and more like confirmation.
Silence changed its texture. It was no longer defensive or tense. It became restorative. I noticed how much energy I had spent anticipating other people's reactions, shaping myself to avoid friction. Without that constant adjustment, my thoughts slowed. I slept more evenly. Decisions stopped feeling like negotiations. Emotional distance didn't make me cold, it made me accurate. I could remember my marriage without distortion, neither excusing it nor dramatizing it. I saw my younger self clearly, not as weak, but as someone operating with limited information. That clarity replaced resentment. I didn't rebuild my life with grand gestures. I did it with small, consistent choices. I chose what to spend, where to go, who to answer. Autonomy revealed itself in ordinary moments, not declarations. What surprised me most was how little I needed validation once control was gone. I wasn't waiting for acknowledgement or apology. My sense of worth no longer depended on being understood by someone who had benefited from misunderstanding me. As the noise faded, meaning began to surface. Not lessons framed as warnings, but understandings I could carry without weight. I learned that peace isn't the absence of conflict, but the absence of self-betrayal. And in that steadiness, I found a version of myself that didn't require defense, explanation, or permission to exist fully. That quiet confidence stayed with me, guiding choices gently, reminding me that stability begins internally, long before circumstances ever change again. What stayed with me after everything settled wasn't the sequence of events, but the recalibration that followed. I learned that power isn't loud or reactive. It doesn't announce itself or demand recognition. Real power moves quietly, often unnoticed until resistance stops working against it. I learned something about family, too. Support doesn't always look like rescue. My father didn't step in to save me from consequences or rewrite my story. He stood close enough to steady what had been destabilized, then let me remain responsible for my own footing. That distinction mattered. It preserved my autonomy while reminding me I wasn't alone. Dependence, I realized, isn't about needing help. It's about surrendering agency. For years, I confused peace with compliance and stability with silence. Letting go of that confusion didn't make me hardened. It made me precise. There was no victory moment, no satisfaction in watching someone else lose ground. What remained instead was equilibrium. I could stand inside my life without bracing for collapse or approval. I trusted my perceptions again, which felt more valuable than any outcome. Survival taught me restraint. It taught me when to speak and when to withdraw. It taught me that dignity isn't proven through endurance, but through alignment with reality, even when that reality dismantles what you hoped would last. I don't tell this story to warn or instruct. I carry it as a reference point, a reminder that losing everything doesn't mean losing yourself, and that the most lasting resolutions happen privately.